Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Climate Change. And it's an special pleasure this time to have Ram Guha with us. I don't think Ram needs too much of an introduction, but I'll just do a quick thing. He has a PhD in sociology, looking at the Chipko movement, which of course was one of our most influential environment movements in India, and then has gone on to teach at the Indian Institute of Science, Stanford, Yale, has held positions in different places. But also, I think very interestingly, is written on many ideas and aspects that influence Indian society, starting from cricket, moving to Gandhi, and of course, the main focus of our conversation today on the environment. So Ram, it's been a very great pleasure to have you here, and thank you for making it across.
Thank you, Harini.
Yeah. So I wanted to start by sort of remembering, I think when I first met you, probably in 92, you and Madhav Gadgil, of course, were working on, was it This Fissured Land then, or was it Ecology and Equity?
Maybe Ecology and Equity, because This Fissured Land came out in January 1992.
Okay. So Ecology and Equity.
Already that
moved.
So we were moving. The sequel, Ecology and Equity, is when we were moving. And when you were a PhD student.
When I was a PhD student at IISc, yes.
Yeah.
And Ecology and Equity and This Fissured Land. I was looking recently on Amazon at the top ecology books. So interestingly, This Fissured Land still continues to be the top ranked ecology or the top selling ecology book on Amazon India. And it's I don't know, 32 years. 32 years. 32 years since you wrote it. Which is very interesting because the book and that I think the jugalbandi between you and Madhav really launched a field of environmental history in India, which didn't exist since then. So what made you start? Why did you pick up the book? What conversations led to starting?
So the book happened, completely by accident. And I grew up in the Foresters Institute in Dehradun, where my father was a scientist, not a forester, but a scientist. He was a paper technologist. And I had already gone to, this was 1958, I was born I did a BA and MA in economics in Delhi, and then went to Calcutta for my PhD. And I had begun research on sort of the sociology of relations between peasants and forests in the Himalaya, kind of what led to the Chipko movement. And I had gone home partly for research, to stay with my parents, partly for research because Dehradun is the foothills of the Himalaya, Uttarakhand, and my research was in Uttarakhand. And Madhav came to give a talk. And I can't even say I had heard of him. Actually, I had heard of his father because I had studied economics as an undergraduate, and Madhav Gadgil's father, D.R. Gadgil, wrote a classic book on industrialization in India, and of course on other things too. He's one of 20th century India's most influential economists. So I knew of the father, and Madhav was giving a talk, and the talk was actually on the social behavior of elephants in Bandipur. He had been doing some work on that, partly with his student Sukumar. And then we started chatting, and then I told him about my work. He said he had just been traveling across different parts of India, writing a long report for the government on forest policy, with his two other students of his, Rauf Ali and S.N. Prasad. So he was getting very interested in the kind of human-forest interface.
And this was 86?
82. 82. It must be 82. Possibly 83. I think it was 82.
Okay.
And then he said, come and spend some time at IISc. And this is before the Center for Ecological Sciences was begun. And Madhav was at the Center for Theoretical Studies. So I was called a visiting scientist, the grand title. And I spent about 4 or 5 months there in 84. And then we just started thinking about what we could do together. Then I went off to America for a couple of years, but we continued corresponding. And this Fissured Land was a ecological history of India, very broad brush. So it was rather, how do I put it, vainglorious, not just ambitious, but vainglorious, because it was all of India through all of human history. So it started prehistory and came down to the 1980s, which is when we were writing it. And it tried to look at what we call we didn't use the fancy term dialectic, but I can use it here, the dialectic between prudence and profligacy. So under what conditions are humans prudent, which is responsible and restrained in their attitude towards nature, the use of natural resources, and in what conditions are they profligate, destructive, excessively oriented towards exploitation and wealth creation without regard for the consequences. So I think the first chapter may even be called Prudence and Profligacy. And I have a kind of a partiality towards alliteration. So each of the chapters in that book is, conquest and control, conflict, conflict.
Yeah.
The alliterations, I forget all the titles, but they're all caste and so they're all alliterative. And prudence and profligacy, I think, is the first chapter, which was mostly written by Madhav. And it was a very interesting collaboration because, firstly, there's a difference in age. So Madhav was 16 years older than me, which is kind of a generation. He's a scientist. I was a sociologist. And there's also a kind of asymmetry in that Madhav was a scientist interested in society.
Right.
I was a sociologist with really no interest or no background in science because after high school I didn't do science, right? So, and I've always believed. I mean, you are a good example of this, Harini. Independent of the fact that you did your PhD with Madhav, you're a good example of this. I believe that in ecological research, which inevitably involves interdisciplinary approaches, drawing from the social sciences and the natural sciences. In ecological research, which is truly interdisciplinary, which transcends the boundary between science and humanities, that kind of research is easier to approach it if you're a broad-minded scientist, rather than if you're even the most broad-minded social scientist, because you lack the technical training and background in science. So, so anyway, so we did this book together. And then when the book came out, Madhav said this book is it's all about profligacy. It's not about, very little about prudence. It's actually about the awful things that have been done to India's forests and forest people, Adivasis, peasants, pastoralists, awful things. So it's mostly about profligacy and conflict. And so we have to write a constructive follow-up book. And that was Ecology and Equity. Now, it may be, the whole ecological literature is doom and gloom, so that might be why this Fisher Land is more popular today than Ecology and Equity 30 years later. But in my view, Ecology and Equity is a better book. It's because we learn from our collaboration. And I think Fisher Land has some very interesting original ideas. But as a book, as a narrative, how it's structured, how it comes together, Ecology and Equity is, I think, better. And I think much of it is still relevant to the environmental crisis India faces today. But yeah, so that's how we did those two books. And it was a very, I'd say this, that obviously that book could not have been, those books were genuine collaborations. Neither of us could have written them on our own. But I think they worked because of Madhav's egalitarian and collaborative approach. I think that's, and I think because I was so much younger than him. I was a PhD student when I began that, and he was already, a professor. He had published his citation classics at Harvard and all that. Yeah, so it was a very, and our temperaments were quite different because, I like working in the archives, Madhav liked working in the field. And so I think some of this was, we complemented one another. Yeah.
And I'm just thinking there weren't that many academic books in India that were written by two people with such kinds of conversations. So this was not common in the Indian context.
You would certainly find not across the boundary of science and humanity. Not at all. Yeah.
And it's not just the fact that it's sociology and ecology, very sort of broadly or crudely put. It's also a way in which, for instance, your work on very irrelevant, or typically what a sociologist does is goes deep into one area, one community, over time looks at it. Yeah. And what ecology tends to do the grand scale, but Madhav himself is a grand scale thinker.
And even Ecology and Equity is all over India. So it's development policy in India from 47 till the 90s.
I mean, you pick
across
both themes,
water, forest, energy, etc. Yeah.
You pick themes that people would have been frightened of picking.
I think Madhav had that intellectual ambition, and I was willing to go along with it. So I'll also say something else. Since we were discussing that, and I've never really talked about it in public very much. And since you know both of us well, it's an appropriate thing. And we are in the town where all of it happened in Bangalore. Though the other end, we are in Azim, Premji, and not in IIC, south or the north. I think I'd say that actually the original ideas in that book. So the first, the major theoretical idea in Fisher Land is this dialect interplay between prudence and profligacy, and how at different points humanity, different societies, one predominates, but the other is always there. Right. So that is really largely Madhav's idea. More or less, it's a 95% Madhav's idea. So really, in the second book too, the structure is, there's a tripartite division between which consists of not just it's tripartite. It's not two, prudence versus profligacy. We argue that broadly, Indian society has three kinds of people: omnivores, ecosystem people, and ecological refugees. Right. So omnivores are urban affluent consumers who can have access, whose ecological footprint, or the term Madhav used was resource catchment, is universal, not just restricted to India. They can get what they want for their needs and their luxuries from all over the world. Ecosystem people are grounded in their local environment. So fisher folk, small peasants, pastoralists, hunter-gatherers, artisans. And then ecological refugees are those who are displaced by large development projects and come. So that framework is Madhav's. So the original ideas are Madhav's. The research was kind of divided. I may have done a little more of the research, maybe 60-40 in my favor. And the rewriting was mine because I was trained to be a writer. So Madhav wrote his chapters and I rewrote them.
Right.
And then I tried to make at least, one of the reasons I think ecology and equity is it's I think a more, from a technical point of view, a more satisfying book, is that if you read Fisherland, you know which sections are those of Madhav and which are mine, which are written by ecology. Yes. But ecology and equity is a little more seamless. So it's more. So, but anyway, so it was really, it was now, it was really a very interesting experience in many, many ways. Yeah.
And I know a lot of younger people who now say that they started getting interested in environmental history because they read those books. And syllabi and classrooms that came up because of these books, So that's, I think, very influential. If you look back 30 years later.
Yeah, we never thought that this. We were just enjoying.
You were enjoying yourself.
Yeah. I know one of the people I would say, many people who helped us. We learned from so many of our colleagues, many of whom are cited in those books, some are not, with our discussions. I think each book is dedicated to 4 people. Fisherland to 4 scholars, Ecology and Equity to 4 kind of more activist kind of people. But also one person I think was very, very vital to all of this. I should mention her on this program because she is kind of the, in some ways the quiet person who held together the Center for Ecological Sciences is Geeta Gadakkar.
Right.
Who kind of was orchestrating this whole, getting me to, from wherever I was in Calcutta, I was in Delhi, and just, helping us with the different drafts. So she was, I think, very important also in this whole process of those 2 books.
Yeah, and in some sense, it also reflects to me your characters or your interests, because Madhav likes the big ideas, but then he does get impatient sometimes with the research. The details of putting everything together.
Right.
And that is really what needs to support the big ideas, because otherwise they just...
So I like digging deep in the archives and, finding out lots of...
So, because I remember also, I think around that time, you had given a talk in CES on very irrelevant, your project. You said, I want to do this. I'm thinking of a book on very irrelevant. I don't remember. We used to do these student club talks, which would start at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock and go on sometimes for 3-4 hours. And you had presented then the idea of very irrelevant, whom I hadn't heard about at all at that time. I mean, I came in sideways. My undergraduate degree is in microbiology, chemistry and zoology. And I also heard Madhav talk similarly like you. CES had the first 10th anniversary.
Okay.
And I thought I was listening to W.D. Hamilton and there was a change in schedule and I heard Madhav. I didn't know who he was. I'd never heard of him. So, and the rest of because it was an integrated PhD program in biological sciences. And the rest of the 6 of the 7 departments did molecular biology of some form or the other and strongly encouraged us not to interact with the ecologists too much because they said they do soft science and you can't rely on their work. It's very loose. I mean, those are the actual words that they used. But I stumbled on Madhav talking and really...
What was he talking on?
He was talking about the importance of doing conservation in India because it was India-centric. You could do creative things in your backyard. You didn't need much money and you could actually be original. And these are a lot of the things that were plaguing with molecular biology. Working on someone else's ideas, using expensive equipment, it would fail half the time. You're in the dark lab, it'd go in at 6 in the morning and come out at 12 at night. And so he resonated so much with what I was thinking about. And like you said, he was very egalitarian because I walked into his lab and said, I mean, I don't know who you are. I heard your talk. I think I might want to do a project with you, but I'll check it out for a month and see if I want to continue. Which, looking back now, was a very, the arrogance of someone very young who didn't know anything. But he was
nurturing and encouraging. Let me just, since we are talking in this vein about Madhav Gadgil, who's now 82 and still active and thinking and writing. Let me, again, these are things I've never talked about in public. 2 stories about, one about his wife, the outstanding climate atmospheric scientist, Sulochana Gadgil, and one about him. So, I was working, did a PhD in Calcutta, I was working in Calcutta. I would come often to collaborate with Madhav. And in 1980, late in 1985, I went to America. My wife Sujata was a designer, was studying at Yale, and I was lucky to have got a visiting lecturership to coincide with part of her graduate program. So I go to America. And they were very happy. I went to see Madhav. Sujata was already in New Haven. I went to see Madhav and Sulochana before leaving. And they said, it's really nice, you'll have a wonderful time. We were like graduate students in Cambridge and all that. And then Sulochana said, and it's so nice, you'll be reunited with Sujata, you'll be separated for a few months. And she said, look, don't have your kids there. She said, don't give them that advantage. Later on, if they want to live anywhere in the world, that's their problem, right? They are free. But don't give them an American citizenship at birth. And we didn't do that. Okay. And maybe I'm not sure whether my kids are happy or sad that we didn't do that, but we had our kids in India. So, and I'm grateful to her for giving me that advice. The second piece of advice, so that was before we went to Yale. Now we came back, and my first job after come back was at IISc before I moved to Delhi. And so I came back in maybe it was May or June of 1987. And you know what it's like. I mean, you know from your time in America as a postdoc at India and other places, great university library. And for a historian, it means much more because, all old documents and bookstores and so on. Absolutely. And so I came back in about June or July 87 to join IISc. And about September, I got an invitation for a conference to go back to somewhere on the East Coast. And I was very excited. I'll spend a week at Yale, I'll see my friends, I'll go to Strat Bookshop in New York. So I told Madhav, I've got this invitation and I want to go. And Madhav said, look, Ram, how are you going just because you loved Yale and you wanted to, what is the conference that exciting? I said, well, I have to think about it. He said, look, I'm not sure, but I want to go back. And he said, look, Ram, you are, he said something like this. I mean, Madhav doesn't have he's got a very spare economical style. I mean, he doesn't have the rhetorical flair I use. So maybe I'm putting words in or images in his mouth. But he said something like this, he said, you're kind of triply fashionable. You're young, you're brown-skinned, you work on ecological research, which is fashionable. You're kind of triply fashionable. You'll get lots and lots of invitations. And you'll be traveling around the world. And before you know, 8 years would have passed and you wouldn't have written a second book. And it was the best advice I've ever got, because I've seen after that people of my profile, and actually even more fashionable than me, because sometimes they're women, so they and they tick some other box, or they're from a minority.
And you tick boxes,
he just told me, look, you'll have no shortage of foreign invitations, but you have to be ruthless about which to accept and which to decline. And since then, I probably have declined 9 out of 10. Right. Now, the older I get, it may become 99 out of 100, but that's a different. And I think these two pieces of advice, Sulochana before we went, and I think that's like.
And it's interesting. What you're really pointing to is that they were patriots of a kind that is somehow fading out. Very
and Madhav's was not so patriotic. The commitment. The research requires steady, sustained work, not conferencing and flitting from place to place. And you also have said that you're articulate, you speak well. So you make an impression one conference, which will be called to the next and the next.
Exactly.
Right. So I think that is, I think it's really very wise advice I got from both of them.
Very interesting. So let me take you back a slightly different direction now. What made you interested in the Chipko movement? And did your childhood growing up in FRI, or was it a childhood interest in nature? So I'm asking also for a reason when we do the Let's Talk Climate Change conversation. Sometimes we have them with journalists, sometimes academics. It's a range of people, And one often reads that people who have an early exposure to nature get interested in nature. And sure, that's very true of many ecologists we know. But sometimes there are people like me who didn't really have that early exposure, but I've been working on it. So I'm sort of curious always to know what is the background that influenced you?
So actually, the answer would be it was not my early exposure to nature. Of course, I had an early exposure to nature because the Foresters Institute, the FRI, you have been there.
Yeah.
It's, I think, the most beautiful residential campus in India. 1,800 acres, 400 species of birds.
I've been there only very briefly.
But the Himalaya on the north, the Shivalik on the left, many variations in seasons, a brutal monsoon, a chilling winter, a hot summer, and a gorgeous spring. And my first publications, the first time I saw my name in print, was at the age of 11 when I wrote a newsletter for birdwatchers. So all the birds, which my father encouraged me to write.
So this is the classic ecology route, because many people write like that.
But that is not how I got into research. So then I went to university and I was studying economics, and I just stumbled into economics, and I was kind of not very good at it. And during my master's, I read very relevant by accident. I mean, I won't go into the details. And I decided sociology is more for me, because economics is about it's very analytical and abstract. It's about equations and numbers and statistics, and sociology is about real human beings. And I was already reading a lot of literature and fiction, so I thought sociology is for me, and I went to Calcutta to do a PhD. And in Calcutta, as we're talking 1980, when it was communism was still very active in the world, and the CPM was in power, I became a kind of leftist, and I wanted to choose a typical left-wing sociological topic, which is, I had to choose a dissertation topic, and I was thinking either of going to Bihar and looking at landlord-labor relations, or looking at relations between capitalists and workers in a factory near Calcutta.
So very Marx-inspired
very typical sociological studies from a left-wing kind of bias, and that's what I was looking at. And while I was thinking through, I mean, the IIM had a PhD program which involved 2 years of coursework. So I was still in my coursework. Early in my second year of coursework, someone from Bangalore, Jayanta Bandyopadhyay, who was then teaching at IIM Bangalore, came to give a talk on appropriate technology and Schumacher and so on. And we started talking after, doctoral students often, a visiting professor comes, you go for tea, and we start chatting. And I said, I'm looking for a topic. He said, where are you from? I said, Dehradun. He said, the Chipko movement started 8 or 9 years ago. And only journalists have written about it. There's been no sociological study.
It's so recent then.
Yeah, it's completely
for us, it's
serendipitous. It was very gentle. So that's why in my new book, Speaking with Nature, he's the first person thanked, because he started me on my journey as an ecological researcher. So it was nothing to do with my childhood upbringing. Of course, it helped that my work was on Chipko and I was from Dehradun, so I had traveled in Garhwal, I spoke the language, I spoke Hindi, I didn't speak Garhwali, but I spoke Hindi, which was kind of adequate for my purposes. But it was not that truth. It was more a love of good writing brought me to Elwyn and then to sociology, and then Jayanta Bandyopadhyay's advice to consider writing on Chipko. And then, of course, once I did, I wasn't sure I would do it. And I wrote 2 letters, came to Dehradun, and I wrote 2 letters in Hindi, one to Chandya Prasad Bhatt and the other to Sundarlal Bahuguna, both the 2 kind of iconic figures of the Chipko movement. Then Bahuguna was traveling, so never replied. Bhatt replied saying, come and see me. So I went and I spent 4 or 5 days with him in Gopeshwar, and that kind of changed my life. Yeah.
And then so after that for you, because you didn't, what I also find very interesting about your trajectory is, you were very unusual for the time. In Indian academia has always been very conventional or traditional, if I can say so. You do a PhD, then you do a postdoc, then you go back and you work on something. Often you're not interdisciplinary. Very often you return to your home ground, as in many people get absorbed into the same university or institution that they did a PhD from, or somehow continue to collaborate on those old ideas. You went off and became an independent writer. So what made you not go the traditional PhD postdoc route and move away from ecology?
I had a job for 10 years after my PhD. And so first I worked in Calcutta, then at Yale, then at IISc, then in Delhi. So 10 years. And in 95, when my wife Sujata, who was then running her design studio in Delhi, we chose to come back to Bangalore because our kids were small. And I was contemplating taking an academic job in Bangalore. But for a variety of reasons, that didn't happen, and then I started writing. So it was partly again accident. Once I started writing, it became more and more enjoyable. But I'd just say, if I may, one person I should mention about who played a profoundly important role in my life, intellectual role in my life. In fact, more than anyone else. Was my teacher in Calcutta, who was a sociologist called Anjan Ghosh, who died tragically young of cancer, about 20 years ago. And he was truly interdisciplinary. So he did literature, then sociology, and had a deep interest in economics and history.
Okay.
And he taught me how to be interdisciplinary in my work, in my approach. He also expanded my understanding of the arts. He made me join a film club in Calcutta where we would go and see classic films. And he gave me some two incredibly good pieces of advice. One was, do not take your first job in the place where you did your PhD.
Right.
The IIM was because I was, I wrote a PhD on Chipko and it had a huge impact because no one had done this kind of work. They were very happy to give me a reader's job, associate straight away. And he said, do not take your first job in the place that you got your PhD. You can return after 10 or 15 years if you make your name elsewhere. That I think, and the other piece of advice was equally striking, and every young scholar or young reader listening to this program, may find it valuable. He said, look, Ram, he said, I was talking about some really nasty, arrogant academic in Calcutta, mean-spirited academic, and I was just who had behaved badly towards somebody else, and I was just telling Anjan this, and he was just a few years older than me, so we had a kind of, though he was my teacher, he said, look, Ram, you must remember something. You'll always distinguish the person from their writing or their scholarship. In the course of your life, you will meet some really wonderful, kind, gentle, compassionate human beings in academics whose scholarship is mediocre. And on the other hand, you'll meet some nasty, arrogant, selfish, cruel human beings who are brilliant scholars. And read their scholarship and don't interact with. So I think that, so I often reflect on, and he taught me many other things. But I think he was someone who was, I would not have written a single book had it not been for Anjan Ghosh. I mean, he mentored me, nurtured me intellectually in every possible way. He expanded my mind, he introduced me to the great works of social history by British scholars, the great works of social anthropology set in Africa, to the importance of literature, the importance of film. I mean, he was just an amazing mentor.
No, I think that's the advantage of doing PhDs in places like that, where you have a tradition of scholarship. I'm just thinking of CES again, because when I came in as a young PhD student, I had an official mentor who was in a different department and a different, in fact, in, I think, developmental biology. But I would spend a lot of time in Raghavendra Gadakkar's library, just looking at all the books he had. And he would be kind enough to let me, books were so expensive those days. So and you had very little access in
and
India.
There was no LibGen or all these shady websites that everyone now has. None of that. Yeah.
So I would always, go to his room and come back with a stack of 6 books, completely different. Evolutionary biology, economics, cities, whatever else it was. And Madhav was similarly generous with his library. So I think that the expanding of the world that you're talking about. And CS would have excellent people who came in. So, but then, so you wrote, coming back to you wrote these 2 books with Madhav, you wrote the book on Verrier Elwin, and then you veered off in a completely different direction in terms of the books and the research.
Yeah, again, I must say that I've been deeply, deeply fortunate in these accidental encounters. Right. So, just reading Elwin, actually in Orissa, doing some economics fieldwork in Orissa, where somebody told me about Elwin. Then, Anjan Ghosh, and even my getting into the history of democracy and Gandhi, the history of democracy happened in that I was very interested in cricket for a long time. I used to play cricket and I was obsessively.
Were you a professional?
I played for my college team along with 2 test cricketers. Future test cricketers. Okay. So Arun Lal and Kirti Azad were my contemporaries. And 4 or 5 Ranji players. So it was the best college team in India. So it was like seriously good. It's like a good, you think of it like something like a good American university basketball team. I mean, so I played a decent amount of cricket. Right. And I would read, and I then wrote an essay which was called Cricket and Colonialism, which eventually became the basis of my book, Corner of a Foreign Field, which is oriented around a family of Dalit cricketers and their struggles. And that essay appeared in a British historical journal, Past and Present. And the person who was then running Picador, Peter Strauss in London, saw it and contacted me and said, why don't you write a history of independent India? Because you write well, you enjoy doing research. So then I got into that. Right. But Gandhi, because of Chipko, because of some family circumstances, where members of my family were deeply influenced by Gandhi and involved, one in mostly in the social reform aspects of Gandhi's work, not in the freedom fighting part of it. I always wanted to work on Gandhi. And my encounters with Chipko activists like Chandi Prasad ji and later with Madhav Gadgil of Narmada Andolan kind of. So Gandhi, I always knew I would have to write about. But India after Gandhi, which is my history of India after independence, and which is probably the book of mine that most ordinary general readers know me
Would
by,
know, yeah.
happened because a visionary publisher in London said, I must write.
So they suggested to you.
Yeah, they read something I'd written on cricket of all things. And this was 97, late 97, early 98. And India had just celebrated 50 years of independence. So, all that was in the air. And Peter Strauss, the publisher, contacted me and said, it looks like all the histories of India end in 1947. It's all about the Mughals or the British Raj. And now 50 years is a long enough period to look back on your history. So why don't you consider writing something on the evolution, the social and cultural and political evolution of India since then? After having read an essay of mine on cricket, where he thought that this person could write on other topics too. Yeah.
But that's again very grand in scope.
Yeah, that is, of course, that's the big,
Yes.
I mean, that is really the most, and I know that again, I think came at a time in my life. I mean, India after Gandhi came at a time in my life when I had enough experience. Because I had written several books before, I knew how to do archival research, I knew how to synthesize a dense body of materials into some kind of argument and narrative. But I was still young enough. I mean, in my 40s, I was mature but not tired. I mean, in my 50s, I couldn't do that kind of book now. I'm just too old. So, I think it was that. Yeah, and it was very exciting because I'm discovering so many things about my own country. Again, Peter Strauss was absolutely right that the literature on Indian history was dominated by the British Raj and what happened before. And they had been in the 50s and 60s were a blank slate to me. I was born in 58. So I knew a little bit of the emergency because I was in university by then. I knew, of course, about the rise of Hindutva because I lived through it in the 80s. I knew about economic liberalization. I knew a little bit about caste politics. But I knew nothing about the Constituent Assembly. I knew nothing about linguistic states, about our foreign policy. So all that is all new to me. Like a lot of the research, I was and that excitement when it's about your own country, but it's brand new to you. Yeah.
I think taking those concepts which we live with, but at the same time we've never thought about, I mean we as a society, intellectually or conceptually, and bringing them to the regular reader is not easy. You require both the understanding at the large scale, but the style of writing. You need to be a good storyteller.
So I think history is, in some ways, there are some similarities between ecology and history. So like ecology, history is a synthesizing discipline.
Yes.
It takes in from many, okay. That's one, obviously one. The second, but I think history is, I've always, it's a branch of social science and of literature. And obviously, if you do rigorous deep research, you have to have an understanding of sociology and economics and political theory to some extent. Otherwise, you're just an anecdotal storyteller. But you also have to communicate well, because unlike, shall we say, other humanities disciplines, say unlike philosophy or economics, and certainly unlike physics or mathematics, where the real originality of your research, to communicate that requires technical language, which is specialist or quasi-specialist. Whereas in history, the depth, the nuance, the richness of your research, the originality of your arguments can be communicated in everyday language. And I think in some ways that's probably true of ecology too. Obviously, because it's such a broad brush kind of thing. Yeah. So.
But it's also the thing. I mean, everyone should be interested in ecology, but very few people are, as in the general reader.
But I think now with the whole climate change thing, it's changing.
It is changing.
Hopefully more and more, yeah.
But everyone is interested in history.
Yeah. And in history, but of course the danger now, particularly with social media, is the weaponization of history, the misuse of history, the distortion of history. I mean, and just selecting one fact and taking it out of context. And then, using it to disparage Gandhi or whatever, So that is something which is not, I think how the historian deals with the age of the WhatsApp universe and Instagram, I think is, I'm probably, I'm towards the end of my career, so I won't have to face it. But younger historians who believe in rigor, in nuance, in being careful, how do they cope with WhatsApp history? I mean, that's something which...
I was asking Sunil Amrit this at the Bangalore Lit Fest, after his book. What the democratization of history can be positive and can be incredibly negative.
Absolutely.
And so what does he feel about it? So he was talking about some very good podcasts, public podcasts, which are really good in terms of bringing rigorous history from an amateur's perspective.
Yeah.
But what do you think has been your advantage, not as a trained historian, but a trained sociologist who uses the rigor of sociology on history in some sense?
So I think, sort of serious history requires original research and primary sources. And though I was trained in sociology in terms of what I read and how I thought and how I analyzed materials, I found that unlike most sociologists who prefer doing fieldwork, I actually was much more comfortable in the archives. And I think it is always I think in some ways actually the book of mine that brings together history, sociology and my passion for cricket is a corner of a foreign field. Because the structuring categories are race, caste, religion and nation. That's how the book is structured, which are really broad brush sociological concepts. And it looks at, how cricket evolved and the controversies around cricket into that framework. So, yeah, I mean, it's like, though over the years I've moved, of course, more and more to biography, which is about a single individual. Now I'm moving, maybe sometimes it's a combination, like Speaking with Nature is 10 individuals, but around broad themes of, nature and society. I think, but this challenge of, you're absolutely right, the democratization of history is broadly good, but also has some very dark undersides. Like if you, I don't want to get into current politics, but if you look at really how history is weaponized in America and India and, in Russia, for rather dangerous political ends. And it's hard because, as I said, I've never really entered into combating WhatsApp history, because then I'll be doing nothing else. I'll be nothing else.
Yes.
So maybe one should do a little more of it. Maybe the podcast that Sunil Lambre talks about may be a good way of entering that. Yeah.
So I want to shift gears a little bit now to speaking with nature. And I know there have been multiple times when I've spoken to you, and I know many others had spoken to you, saying, when are you going to write another book on the environment? And I think I've told you this before, that when we teach undergraduate students on environmental history, especially from a global South or Indian perspective, often we come back to one of your books, which is How Much Should We Consume? And that, especially that opening essay. And it's a fascinating essay, but it's sad in some sense that there's only that. And then otherwise, if you're looking at the history of British India from a forest perspective, there are your two pieces in EPW, which are fascinating pieces, but not easy to teach to an undergraduate audience, for instance, because they're academic pieces. And so for a long time, we've been actually looking for books, and I wish we had more of this kind, but it was, so what made you come back to this? So it's really nice to have Speaking with Nature.
Well, I'm so happy I came back to it, because, and it was partly, so I think it was, so I kind of wanted to write a book like this. I wasn't sure what form it would take, but I wanted to write a history of a book on early environmentalists in India. At first I thought I'd do it thematically. I'd look at forests and the wilderness and the city, and rather than those themes through individuals. And then I got distracted or diverted. I wouldn't say distracted, diverted into political history and biography and Gandhi and so on. And doing the two or three things happened, or three things I suppose happened. One was that during the pandemic, I was, like all of us, I was unloaded. I couldn't travel. And I couldn't do fresh research on Gandhi or Indian democracy or the other themes that were occupying me. And I found in my notebooks, in my pile of Xeroxes, in my collection of old pamphlets, I had collected lots of interesting stuff on all these thinkers. And I thought that I have enough for a book once the pandemic ends. If I just do 3-4 months more research, I should probably have that. I think once. So I realized that I had actually early on done a fair amount of work. A second thing was obviously that after decades of being unfashionable, environmentalism was becoming relevant again, because the environmental movement in India peaked in the 70s and 80s. And then 90s and beyond, with economic liberalization, environmentalists became the favorite whipping boy. They were giving India backwards, back. They were like agents of foreign powers. And then climate change made everyone an environmentalist again. And the third was meeting young people, young scholars in the environment, including in Kriya University, where I started teaching. Right. And people in Bangalore who would come to talks I was giving, and Bangalore in some ways is really an epicenter of, you could say, ecological research, because there is CS, there is ATRI, there is NCF. There is your center here in Azim Premji University, and so people would come up to me at talks and say, "Sir, when are you writing on this again?
Right.
You should come back to this." And so I often, when I was writing on politics and on Gandhi, people would come up to me, and some people, so these young doctoral scholars would say that we read your thing, but it's a long time, and so I thought I must. And all of this came together, and then I thought a way of writing this book. Yeah.
It's a fascinating sweep, I think, of the characters that you select, because they're British, they're Indian, they're from other parts of the world, but they've all influenced us. And you know about some, but many names are completely unknown.
And actually, what is nice about the reaction to the book, Harini, is that there are 10 people. Actually, 9, because one is a couple, the Howard side. 9 chapters.
Yeah.
And some people, it's nice when you write about multiple people, that different readers have different reactions. I write a chapter on Geddes a lot. Or I knew about Geddes, like an architect would say. I knew about Geddes, but I didn't know about Mirabai. So I think that's nice, because it means that obviously some are vaguely familiar, but others, depending on where you're coming from. Yeah.
In fact, I was thinking of just this the morning. I was speaking to a reporter who was writing on eco-fiction and climate fiction. And she was asking me, do you think that books should be dystopic or should they be utopian, and what appeals to the reader? And I said, from my perspective, readers are of different flavors. You need to write the best book that you're writing.
Absolutely.
And it's going to appeal to somebody.
That's well put,
And I think that's what you have. You have the 10 people and their different backgrounds, and someone is going to find something interesting that they...
I hope so, yeah.
So now where from here? And I'm asking this in sort of 2 perspectives. One is just to know what are you working on? Will you write more on ecology, which I hope you will.
So, Harini, I will write no more on ecology. I will write the occasional column. But I don't think I have enough to write a book on ecology, on environmental themes. This is you could say, my last word on.
Which is helpful.
Okay. I still follow it. I read what other people are writing. I'll write the occasional column, I might review interesting books which younger scholars have written. I'll do that. But I cannot, I think there are 2 reasons I can't do it. One is simply age. I'm 66. Okay. The other is where we began. We began where I said early on that it's easier for easier for Madhav to collaborate with me. It's easier for a scientist to get into humanistic research. Now, environmental history has moved on a lot from when I started. It's become much more sophisticated and much more interdisciplinary. And so the historians who get into environmental research now know much more about hydrology and science, soil science and climate and biodiversity and species loss than I ever did. Because so early on, sometimes they educated in places which have integrated. Because I did, I just did economics and nothing else. So I think I'm kind of, in a sense, behind the curve methodologically. So I don't think I can. I think I could write an intellectual history. I could write Speaking with Nature because it's about human beings, and I also have a biographer's training, right?
But would you ever think of collaborating with, let's say, a young PhD student like yourself?
I don't think they will get anything from me. I don't think so. So I think, I don't think I can. So it's a huge issue, and it's, it's like I was just having, last week I was having I won't mention the person, but a very well-known, one of our best economic commentators who writes in the press, and we were having a long exchange and I said that, we were having disagreements about the environmental crisis. I said, for you, it is, you recognize there's a problem, but you think good policies and right prices and withdrawing subsidies will solve it. And for me, it's existential. It requires deep structural changes, intellectual, philosophical, political, legal, moral. So that's how that argument kind of, I said, you can't convince me, I can't convince you, right? So I recognize that it is really a huge, huge issue. And that's what the research on ecological themes is so vital. And what I feel particularly frustrated about as an Indian is that unlike when I began, Harini, when I began in the 1980s, there wasn't a reservoir of scientific expertise in the ecological realm. So today you have, of course, broad brush ecologists of high quality, And I'm talking people in between the 30s and the 50s and younger who are doing
Yeah,
PhDs.
yes.
But you have people who work on cities, who work on water, who work on soil, who work on, rivers, who work on chemical contamination, air pollution, whatever. I mean, this who work on designing sustainable transport policies, energy policies, housing, all this
Yes.
expertise is there, and it is never consulted by any state or central government
Yes.
for a variety of reasons.
Yes.
Either it's ignorance or because their recommendations will help ordinary citizens as well as nature, but they go against, how to win elections and garner money or the interests of contractors. And this is across political parties.
yes.
This hostility to scientific inputs from well-trained ecological scientists is all across. That's why the Gadgil report was buried by everyone,
exactly.
from the CPM to the BJP and the Congress and the DMK and
Right.
what else if there. So I think that's what, but that's why it's so urgent and so important. And that's why that makes me upset, because we do, unlike in the 80s, we didn't have this reservoir of high quality scientists, in our different universities, in our ICERs, in our IITs, and, in kind of high quality NGOs. And I wish a way could be found of bringing all this wonderful, rich knowledge into making the lives of ordinary Indians more, less stressful, which it actually can, and also helping, revive nature, which it also can. So I think, so I may write columns, kind of angry polemical columns from time to time, but I don't have any original research to contribute.
However, that said, I mean, I'm just thinking of the initiatives that you have done, both formal and informal, like the New India Foundation.
Right.
A lot of the books have been ecology
Some
books.
of them, yeah. Some of the very good ones, yeah.
Some very good ones, and they would not have been.
That will continue.
Really,
that will continue. Yeah.
They would really have come into fruition, at least some of them I know,
Yeah.
if it wasn't for the NIFB. I think they would have remained ideas in people's heads.
Yeah, so that. So
and the other thing I know that you have done informally, I mean, I know from my own experience with Nature in the City, you help even with the title, getting it through, finding me a publisher, and that you've been doing for many people who want to write.
That's of course an obligation to anyone.
Yeah.
Sure.
Would you be wanting, I mean, I'm just thinking aloud, but...
so for someone sent me a manuscript to comment on. So like there's a young scholar, again I wouldn't name them, a young scholar who said, who's writing a book which seems very interesting on a kind of human ecological theme. And so this person sent me the proposal and said, I'm writing a book based on my PhD. Will you comment on it? I said, of course. I said, my son is getting married once that and sent it to me. So I would love to, because I also, firstly, I will learn from it. It'll keep me engaged with what brilliant young scholars are doing. And what I can contribute more is in terms of a little bit of restructuring and style and so on. Right. Absolutely. So that is because that is beneficial to me also. It's not the benefit to them. It's beneficial to me also, because I'm keeping abreast of it. So in that sense. But I don't think I have any original research of my own of any weight and substance to contribute in this field. I mean, we were discussing before we started recording. I have some more things to say about Gandhi at book length. So I'll work on that. So,
okay. Which sounds wonderful. Will ecology be a part of that?
A small part of it.
Okay. So
on Gandhi, yes.
On Gandhi,
ecology will be a part of it. Yeah.
So the last question I have for you is, both as a teacher and a parent, when you work with young people or you think of your children, maybe the children they will have, and the ecological or environmental crisis. Climate change is only one of the crises that we see on the environment, like with biodiversity collapse, air pollution, and larger structural issues, which are the fact that we seem to think that economic growth can continue on the back of nature, that we'll find either an economic fix or a technical fix. We'll have a carbon tower that sucks carbon
or
out
we'll colonize the other planets.
We colonize other planets. Where is you're a hopeful person as far as I know. So
I would say,
or are you
I
not?
carry on. I mean,
or are you not? What is your fears or hopes for the future, and what do you think we should be doing?
I mean, it's like I must say that my fears and hopes are mostly connected with my country, which includes the ecological crisis my country faces, but there are several other crises my country faces. I'm more concerned about that. So, in some ways, like, we had this chat before we had our show that your podcast has climate change in the title. And I am an environmental scholar before climate change and beyond climate change. So climate change is obviously a vital, crucial issue. But in a sense, in some ways, I'm still rooted in the human world and some of the human crises we face, of which climate change is only one. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. But I'd say something about, again, obviously teaching. I mean, I actually, I'm only good at working with young PhD scholars and beyond. I'm not a very good undergraduate teacher.
Really?
And I would be disastrous at the school level, unlike some people I've known. So, like, my mother was an inspirational high school teacher. My sister, and my own family, and my sister, who's a doctor, who's always worked in a public hospital and retired after having been a professor at St. John's. Before that at KMC Manipal, before that Chipko, again was a teacher. And my father was actually very unusual because he was a research scientist, but he could teach at all levels. So he would PhD produced about 30 PhD students, but then he could even teach an 8-year-old child, about language and so on. So I realized that I actually, in that I don't have I have an ability to work with older people, and I think those who can, like, my father was quite exceptional. I mean, he could just work across all levels, and I think that's a very rare gift. Yeah.
So, but why would you think you would say that you work better with PhD students? Is it a certain way of?
I think it is just I'm saying so based on my experience. That it's like just how I am. Yeah.
Because you can give talks to 8-year-olds and keep them entertained.
I cannot 8-year-olds. I can give talks to 18 or 20-year-olds or above, but those are mostly monologues. I'm giving a lecture. I'm giving a bhashan. Okay, it's not like that interactive. Okay. And my wife that often tells me I'm very impatient with questions. And sometimes I can be. So I think, but with someone who's like a PhD student, again, so I won't take a name. So this person who's writing this book on human ecology, which is linked to conservation policy, and is like, it finished his PhD 3-4 years ago. But the other day I met a brilliant young PhD student who's just started his PhD. And he's working on kind of energy and agriculture. And I had a fabulous conversation with him, So I think at that level I can, so I think that would continue. And people would, and I probably, even there is more I'm learning from them, because I think I said, the field of ecological research has moved on so much from where I was, that you need some basic grounding in science to do original work now. So if you're an environmental historian, yeah.
I see that, and I'm just curious then, because if I can end with one last question for you, because there will be many young people watching this, perhaps many of them in the state or the state of mind that you were when you started looking at your PhD. What questions do I ask? So if you had to give one piece, not of advice, because I know you don't like
so
that,
I would say,
what would you say?
I mean, the one piece of advice I'd give any writer and any scholar is be motivated by what is inside you. What moves you, what excites you, what challenges you in choosing your research topic. Don't listen to the background noise, what your father, your mother, your professor, your peers are doing. If you really want to do something, I like my book on Elwin, no one wanted me to write. I mean, India's greatest anthropologist said I was an idiot to write on Elwin, because he was a marginal eccentric. Historians admired, said, you've written social history, why do you write only one person? So don't just be motivated by that. And that's the main piece of advice I'd give. And certainly don't be motivated by becoming famous or popular.
Because it doesn't work that way.
That is because you won't do your
shows.
So that's just what challenges you, excites you intellectually, emotionally, morally, personally, and just give it your all.
I think morally and personally comes very close, very important, right? We often discount that a lot. But clearly it's what has...
I think that is what I would give to any young scholar.
But thank you, Ram. I think we've covered a wide range of things, but it's been great to have you. Thanks very much.